For the first half of the movie, Laura, the woman everyone is searching for, is already dead. A detective wanders through her silent apartment, studying the objects she left behind. And above the fireplace hangs a portrait of her, luminous, unreachable, more alive than anyone breathing in the room. By the time the film ends, half the men in it have fallen in love with the painting. And in the darkened theaters of 1944, so did America. What almost none of those people knew, as they gazed up at that flawless face, was that the real woman who had posed for it was already losing everything. Not her fame, not her beauty. Those would last for years. She was losing something quieter and far crueler. And the strangest part of her story is that the thing which destroyed her looked at the time exactly like love. Her name was Gene Tierney, and she once said that she would have traded every frame of every film she ever made, gladly, to forget a single afternoon. She was born in Brooklyn, New York, in November of 1920, into a family that looked, from the outside, like a portrait of American success. Her father, Howard Tierney, was a prosperous insurance broker, a decorated veteran of the First World War, and a man who ran his household the way he ran his business, with control. Gene would describe him plainly in later years. He was, she said, the lord and master of the house. Everything ran to his order. Everyone performed for his approval. Her mother, Belle, a former teacher, had given her daughter a face that stopped conversations mid-sentence. When Gene was 5, the family moved to a large, handsome home in Greens Farms, Connecticut, the kind of place with wide lawns and clipped hedges and the appearance of perfect calm. The appearance was the point. Behind it were arguments that carried through the walls at night, and a small girl lying awake and listening to them, learning, young, that the smooth surface a family shows the world and the truth underneath are two entirely different things. It was a lesson she would spend her whole life proving. Her mother she remembered differently, with a tenderness edged in sorrow. Belle was, by her daughter's account, a naturally refined beauty with crystal green eyes, a quick wit, and a genuine, uncomplicated kindness. But she was also, Gene came to see, a woman without the hardness the world seemed to demand of her, someone who did not have the aggressiveness to resist all that life put in front of her, and so absorbed it instead, quietly, without complaint. It was, though the girl could not possibly have known it then, a description that would one day fit Gene herself almost exactly. She had inherited her mother's beauty. She would inherit, too, her mother's terrible gentleness in the face of things that ought to have been fought. She was sent to the best schools money could buy, Miss Porter's in Connecticut, and then a finishing school in Lausanne, Switzerland, where she learned French and painting, and the particular poise of a girl being quietly groomed for a good marriage. She was being shaped into an ornament. By 17 she was fluent, graceful, and so beautiful that strangers stared, and everyone who met her assumed her life would be an easy one. Beauty like that, people believed, was a kind of insurance policy against suffering. They were wrong, of course. They usually are. There is a story about how Hollywood first saw her. On a family tour of the Warner Brothers lot, a cameraman looked at the teenage Gene and turned to the man beside him and said something offhand, that she was, in his professional opinion, not bad. It was barely a compliment, but the idea lodged in her, and she could not shake it loose. She wanted to act, not merely to be looked at. She had been looked at her whole life. She wanted to do something with all that attention. She wanted to be good. Her father agreed to back her, and here the story takes its first dark turn, because his help would become one of the great betrayals of her life. He guided her first to the Broadway stage, where she drew real notice, and then, when Hollywood came calling, he did something that would quietly poison the years ahead. He formed a corporation. He called it Beltier, after his wife, to manage his daughter's earnings. He made himself, in effect, the sole business of Gene Tierney. She was barely 20, and she did not question it. Why would she? He was her father. He had always been the one in control. She simply signed where she was told. 20th Century Fox put her under contract, and the studio chief, Darryl Zanuck, began the long, deliberate machine of building a star. There were early roles, a fresh-faced Turnopo, cite Henry Fonda, and then a smoldering exotic part in the Shanghai gesture that made audiences lean forward in their seats. The studio wanted to fix a slight overbite in her smile. She refused, and that one small imperfection, the only thing about her face that was not quite perfect, became one of the most famous smiles in America. She was, by every measure, on her way. She was not yet 21 years old. And then she fell in love with precisely the wrong man, in precisely the way her family had feared. His name was Oleg Cassini, a charming, ambitious fashion designer, a count with a European title and very little money, already twice divorced, and everything Howard Tierney did not want for his daughter. Her parents forbade it outright. So in June of 1941, at the age of 20, Gene ran off and married him anyway. Her father was incandescent. The rift that opened between them never fully closed, and a few years later it would harden into something far worse than a father's disappointment. When Jean finally sat down and looked closely at the corporation her father had built around her money, she understood what she was seeing. He had been taking far more than a father ever should. The man who had launched her career had also been quietly draining it. She took him to court. She won. And in a real sense, she never had a father again. But that was still ahead of her. In 1941, she was 20, and famous, and in love. And the worst thing in her life was her family's cold silence. She had no idea how gentle that grief would look someday, in hindsight. The films that made her immortal came fast. In 1944, at 23, she was cast in Laura, the noir about a detective who falls in love with a dead woman's portrait, only to have the woman herself walk back through the door alive. What few people know is that Jean very nearly turned it down. She read the script and doubted herself, wondered whether she was truly beautiful enough to play a woman that every character spends the film obsessing over. She thought perhaps the part belonged to Hedy Lamarr, a more untouchable, statuesque kind of beauty. It is a strange, revealing thing. The woman the whole world would soon call flawless did not believe she was flawless enough. The director, Otto Preminger, knew better. He said of her that she was less an actress than an apparition. He meant it as the highest praise, and audiences agreed. Gene Tierney's face, cool, composed, impossibly remote, became one of the defining images of the decade. Men wrote her letters by the sackful. Soldiers overseas pinned her picture to the walls of their barracks. She was, at 23, an ideal that millions of people had fallen in love with, and almost knew. One of them knew the first true thing about her. The very next year came the performance of her life. In Leave Her to Heaven, she played Ellen, a woman so consumed by jealous, possessive love that she calmly destroys everyone who threatens it. It was a beautiful monster of a role, shot in lush, saturated technicolor, that made Jean look less like a woman than like something painted. It earned her the only Academy Award nomination of her entire career for Best Actress. She was 25. She did not win. That year the Oscar went to Joan Crawford for Mildred Pierce, two women at the absolute peak of their beauty and their power, seated in the same room, competing for the same golden statue. And here is what the audience could not have known. Both of them were privately coming apart, in ways that would not surface for decades. The two most luminous faces in that theater were each hiding a life that would have broken most people. Hollywood was very good at that. It sold the surface and buried the rest. I want to stop here for just a moment, before the part of this story that is hard to tell. Because if you have lived any length of time at all, you already know something these glossy old films never show you. You know that the people who look the most untouchable are so often the ones carrying the heaviest thing, quietly, in a place where no one thinks to look. You have almost certainly known someone like that, a neighbor, a sister, a woman in a photograph who was smiling on the very worst day of her life. Perhaps at some point, you have been that person yourself. If stories told this way move you, the true ones, researched carefully from real sources and told with respect for the woman at the center of them, then take a moment to subscribe to Silk and Sorrow. This is what we do here. We give these lives the telling they deserve, gently, honestly, all the way to the end. Now, back to Jean, because in the summer of 1943, before Laura, before Leave Her to Heaven, before the fame that was still rushing toward her, she did something ordinary and generous and deeply patriotic, and it cost her more than anything else in this entire story. The war was on, and the stars of Hollywood volunteered their evenings at a place called the Hollywood Canteen, a club where servicemen shipping out to the front could spend one night dancing with a real movie actress and carry that memory with them across an ocean. It was a lovely, good-hearted thing to do. In June of 1943, at 22 years old and newly pregnant with her first child, Gene made her one and only appearance there. She danced, she smiled, she shook hundreds of eager hands, and then she went home. It was the kind of night a person forgets by the following week. She had no reason to remember it. Not yet. Somewhere in that cheerful crowd was a young woman who should not have been there at all. She was sick with measles, rubella, and she was under quarantine, ordered to stay away from other people until she was no longer contagious. But she was a devoted fan, and she wanted, more than she wanted to be careful, more than she wanted to obey the rules, to meet Gene Tierney in person, just once. So she slipped out. She stood in the line. And at some point during that ordinary, happy evening, she came close enough to pass her illness to a pregnant woman who would carry it home without the faintest idea that anything had happened. Rubella, in a woman early in her pregnancy, is one of the quietest catastrophes in all of medicine. The mother barely feels it. A mild rash, a few days of feeling low, nothing more. The child in the womb feels everything. In October of 1943, Gene gave birth prematurely to a daughter. They named her Daria. She weighed a little over 3 pounds. The rubella had reached the baby in the womb and done its full, patient, terrible work. Daria was born deaf. She was partially blind, her small eyes already clouded by cataracts. And she was severely developmentally disabled, in a way that would never let her live an independent life, or speak more than a few words, or fully know the mother who loved her so completely. Gene tried. At 23, a rising star and a new mother, she brought her daughter home and tried to care for her there. For a few years, she held on. But the needs were beyond what any amount of love could meet, and the marriage was already straining under the weight of it. And eventually, when Daria was around 4 years old, Gene was persuaded to place her daughter in an institution where she would remain, cared for by strangers, for the rest of her life. To read Gene's own account of that decision, decades later, is to feel the weight she carried out of that room and never once set down. She did not stop grieving it. She simply learned to grieve it silently, the way she had learned as a child to keep the surface smooth. And here is the cruelest mercy of all, the one small kindness the world had not yet taken from her. She did not know why. She believed, as any grieving mother might, that this was simply a tragedy of nature, cruel and random, and no one's fault. She could mourn it as an accident of God. For a little while longer, she was allowed to keep that. And so, for more than a year, she lived inside that mercy. She grieved her daughter the way you grieve a storm or an illness, as something that had simply happened, terrible and blameless and beyond anyone's reach. She rebuilt her days around it. She went back to the studio. She learned to smile again for the cameras. And all the while, walking somewhere through the same bright city, was a young woman who carried the one answer Gene did not even know she was missing. A young woman who believed, when she finally offered it up, that she was handing her idol a lovely gift. More than a year after Daria was born, Gene was at a garden party in Hollywood when a bright, eager young woman approached her and asked for an autograph. And then, the way fans sometimes do, she mentioned with a smile that the two of them had actually met once before, at the Hollywood Canteen, and she said, cheerfully, as though it were a charming little detail, a badge of how much she loved her, that she had wanted so badly to meet Gene that she had broken quarantine to do it. She had been sick at the time, she explained, German measles, but she simply had to come. Gene went very still. She understood, in that single instant, all of it at once. The measles, the pregnancy, the 3-pound baby born too soon, the blindness, the deafness, the years in the institution, the entire ruin of her daughter's life, traced back along one clean, unbroken line to one stranger's afternoon of devotion. It had not been an accident of God, after all. It had been a choice, a small, thoughtless, adoring choice made by someone who loved her. She said nothing. She turned, and she walked away. And later she wrote one sentence about that moment that may be the saddest thing any Hollywood star has ever set down on a page. After that day, she said, she no longer cared whether she was ever anyone's favorite actress again. That was the afternoon her fame died inside her. The cameras would keep rolling for years yet, but the woman they were pointed at had already stopped believing that any of it meant a single thing. And this is where her story becomes quietly, unbearably ironic, because she kept working. Through the late 1940s, some of her finest films came one after another. She was tender and luminous as the widow in The Ghost and Mrs. Muir. She was moving in The Razor's Edge, a performance many critics of the day actually praised. She moved through a whole run of shadowy film noirs, Whirlpool, Night in the City, Where the Sidewalk Ends, carrying picture after picture on the strength of that famous, composed face. And the critics, for the most part, dismissed her. They called her wooden, cold. A great beauty they allowed, but not much of an actress. Pretty, one reviewer sniffed, but hardly the type. Reviewer after reviewer looked at that still, controlled surface and saw only a mannequin, and never once guessed that the stillness they were mocking was the look of a woman holding herself together by sheer force of will. It would take decades, and a director named Martin Scorsese, to say out loud what they had all missed, that Gene Tierney was one of the most underrated actresses of her entire era. In her best moments, if you watch closely, her calm gaze flickers with something underneath it, something close to fear. They thought it was bad acting. It was the truth leaking through. Think of that the next time one of her films flickers past on a late-night channel. That famous, glassy composure everyone once mistook for coldness. She was not cold. She was a woman who had learned, in the hardest way a person can learn it, that the surface must stay smooth, no matter what is breaking apart beneath it. She had learned it as a child, lying awake and listening through the walls. She had perfected it as a young star, and she was practicing it still, frame by frame, take after take, even as her entire life quietly came apart just outside the edge of the shot. The marriage could not survive what had happened. She and Cassini separated, then reconciled long enough to have a second daughter, Christina, they called her Tina, in 1948, and then finally divorced in 1952. In between, Gene did what beautiful, wounded, famous people so often do. She was pursued by extraordinary men, and not one of them stayed. While filming in the mid-1940s, she met a thin, charming, ambitious young naval officer and future congressman named John Kennedy. It became a real romance, not a rumor, but something that mattered to them both. She wanted to marry him, and Kennedy told her, with the cool clarity of a man who had already mapped out his own future, that he never could. She was a divorced woman, a Catholic candidate's liability, an obstacle to the life he intended to build, so she ended it. Years later, and this is one of those details almost too pointed to be real, the man who had refused to marry Gene married a young woman named Jacqueline, and the designer hired to dress the new First Lady, to make Jackie Kennedy an icon of American elegance, was Gene's own former husband, Oleg Cassini. Gene had been, in a sense, the first draft of a life she was never allowed to have. When Kennedy was elected president, she sent him a warm note of congratulations, without a trace of bitterness. She had learned by then not to expect the men in her life to choose her. There was Prince Ali Khan, the famous international playboy, freshly parted from the actress Rita Hayworth. For a time it seemed real. He was besotted, and the newspapers ran ahead of the truth with talk of a wedding. But he was a Muslim prince, and she a divorced Catholic actress with a fragile hold on her own health, and the marriage everyone whispered about simply never came. It was the same shape her life kept taking, over and over. The great romance, the certain wedding, and then the quiet closing of a door. She was, it seemed, a woman men adored and would not keep. And through all of it, in the background of her life, there was another famous man behaving in a way that almost no one knew about, because he had asked, specifically, that no one ever know. Howard Hughes, the reclusive billionaire, the aviator, the eccentric, had been fond of Gene for years, and when he learned about Daria, about the little girl in the institution and the lifetime of medical care she would need, he quietly took over the cost of it, all of it, year after year. He never publicized it. He never used it to try to win Gene back, never held it over her, never let it become a story. He simply paid, in silence, for the care of a child who was not his own, because he could, and because he knew Gene could not carry that burden alone. She never forgot it. In a story with very few gentlemen in it, Howard Hughes, of all the men in the world, turned out to be one of them. By the 1950s, the thing Gene had been carrying so quietly for so long began, at last, to show. She had trouble concentrating. She lost her grip on scenes she once could have played in her sleep. In 1953, she was cast opposite Clark Gable in Mogambo and had to give the part up. It went instead to a young Grace Kelly, who earned an Oscar nomination for it. Gene's career, the thing that had come so effortlessly to her a decade earlier, was slipping through her fingers, and she did not fully understand why it was happening. In 1955, at 34, she made a film called The Left Hand of God, opposite Humphrey Bogart, and Bogart watched her closely on that set. He had a sister who had struggled for years with mental illness, and he recognized in Gene the signs he already knew, the confusion, the fear moving behind the composed and beautiful surface. With real, unshowy kindness, he steadied her through the shoot, covering for her when she faltered, holding a scene together when she drifted. And then he told her plainly that she needed help. It may well have been the kindest thing anyone in Hollywood ever did for her. It would also be her last film for 7 years. She checked herself into a clinic, and then, in time, into another. She spent a stretch at the renowned Menninger Clinic in Kansas. The diagnoses of that era were crude, and they called what she had by several different names, none of them quite right. What she almost certainly suffered was the illness we now call bipolar disorder, in a decade that understood almost nothing about it, and treated it with brute force. The treatment of the time was electroshock. Gene received it again and again, by some accounts more than 24 separate times. It calmed her, and it took her memory. Whole stretches of her life simply vanished. She would say afterward that the treatments had erased pieces of her past she could never recover. Birthdays, films, faces, entire years, gone as though they had never happened at all. Sit with what that means in this particular life. Here was a woman whose whole existence had been defined by one single afternoon she would have given anything to forget. And the treatment meant to heal her mind burned away almost everything except that. The one memory she prayed to lose, she kept. Countless others she would have treasured were the ones that disappeared. To understand what she endured, you have to remember what those places were in those years. There was little gentleness in the treatment of the mind then, and even less understanding. A patient who arrived frightened and confused was met with locked doors and isolation and the machine. Gene submitted to all of it because she was told it would make her well, and because she wanted so badly to be well, to be steady, to be present, to stop being afraid of her own thoughts. Instead, she came out the other side, a stranger to her own life, holding a handful of surviving memories like the last few photographs pulled from a house that had burned to the ground. She would spend years afterward patiently trying to reassemble herself from what little the fire had left. In 1957, at 36, she reached the very lowest point of all, a moment of despair so total that she came close to not surviving it. She was talked back gently by people who loved her. But it is no exaggeration to say that by the end of that decade, Gene Tierney had lost her daughter, her marriages, her career, and great portions of her own mind. She had been one of the most envied women alive, and there was almost nothing left of the life that envy had ever been aimed at. And then, as if the story required one final indignity, her private catastrophe was taken from her and sold as entertainment. In 1962, the mystery writer Agatha Christie published a novel called The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. In it, a glamorous American film actress discovers that her child was born disabled because a devoted fan, sick with German measles, had broken quarantine to come and meet her. The parallel to Gene's life was not subtle, and it was not accidental. The Agatha Christie estate has since acknowledged that Christie drew directly on Gene's tragedy. Years later, the book was made into a lavish film with Elizabeth Taylor playing the role that had been built, detail by detail, out of Gene Tierney's worst day on Earth. The single most agonizing private wound of her life had become a plot, a puzzle for readers to solve on a rainy afternoon. Grief, repackaged and sold in paperback. She had lost even the ownership of her own sorrow. And yet, and this is the part that the tragedy so often leaves out, the part these stories rarely bother to tell. Gene Tierney did not end in that darkness. In that same year, 1962, at 41, she did something remarkable. She came back. Her old director, Otto Preminger, cast her in his political epic, Advise and Consent, and she stepped in front of the cameras again after 7 years away. Watch her in it, and you can see everything she had survived written right into her performance. She holds her head high and very still. She moves through the long scenes as if walking on eggshells, carrying herself with enormous care. And you can feel, underneath the poise, exactly how frightened she is. It is one of the bravest things a person can do, to return, in full view of the world that had watched you fall apart, and simply try again. The reviews were kind. She followed it with Toys in the Attic and a few more roles, and her acting, everyone agreed, was as good as it had ever been. But the great demand for her was gone, and Gene, to her lasting credit, did not fight to claw it back. She had spent her whole life being wanted by an industry that had never truly seen her. Now, quietly, she chose to walk away from it, years earlier than most actresses ever would. She had nothing left to prove to the people who had only ever loved her face. In 1960, at 39, she had married a Texas oil businessman named Howard Lee, and for the first time in her entire adult life, she was with a man who simply, steadily stayed. They lived quietly in Houston, far from the studios and the flashbulbs and the machinery that had made and unmade her, and in that quiet, something like peace finally reached her. It is worth saying, too, that hers was not only a life of sorrow. She had met a queen and shaken hands with kings. She had sat and talked with Picasso. She had been, for a time, the most beautiful woman in the most glamorous industry on earth, and she had done real and lasting work inside it. The tragedy of Gene Tierney was never that her life was empty. It was that a life so crowded with extraordinary things could be so quietly hollowed out from the inside, by a single grief she was never once allowed to set down. In 1978, at 57, she published a memoir. She called it Self-Portrait, and in it she told the whole of it, plainly. The illness, the shock treatments, Daria, the men who had come and gone, the bright young woman at the garden party. She wrote it all down with a directness and a lack of self-pity that startled the people who read it, expecting a movie star's vanity and finding instead a survivor's honesty. She spoke out openly against the electroshock that had cost her so much of her own memory, hoping others might be spared it. She had spent her entire life being looked at. At the end of it, on her own terms, she chose finally to be heard. There was real courage in that. In an age when a movie star's mental illness was a shameful secret to be hidden at all costs, buried by the studios, denied to the press, whispered about only behind closed doors, Gene Tierney put her own breakdown on the page and signed her name beneath it. She named the clinics. She described the shock treatments. She admitted the despair. And she did it so that some other frightened woman, reading it alone in her own kitchen years later, might understand that she was not strange and not to blame and not beyond reaching. It was, in the end, the most generous performance of her life, and the only one that was entirely, unguardedly true. But some wounds do not close, no matter how much peace a person finds. When Howard Lee died in the early 1980s, Jean was left alone with her memory, that broken, unreliable thing the doctors had left her. And her first husband, Oleg Cassini, would later tell of the phone calls he began to receive in those years. Late at night, the telephone would ring, and it would be Gene, and she would talk to him warmly, easily, as though no time had passed at all, as though it were still 1943, the year Daria was born, the year of the canteen, the year everything broke. Of all the years the shock treatments had stolen from her, that was the one her mind kept returning to again and again in the dark. She could not stop going back to the beginning of the end. Gene Tierney died in Houston on the 6th of November, 1991, of emphysema. She was 70 years old, just 13 days short of her 71st birthday. Her daughter Daria, the 3-pound baby from that October in 1943, outlived the mother who had never stopped grieving for her. So did Tina. And in a last quiet symmetry of the kind this story seems to specialize in, both of Gene's daughters would one day die at the very same age, 66 years old. The portrait still hangs, of course, not the real one. That was only ever a prop, a photograph worked over with an artist's paint, made to be beautiful and nothing more. But the image endures. Turn on a classic movie channel late enough on a quiet night, and eventually there she is again, Laura, luminous above the fireplace, a woman so beautiful that men fall in love with her before they have heard her speak a single word. That is how the world chose to remember Gene Tierney, as a face, as a painting, as the most beautiful woman anyone had ever seen. But a painting cannot be hurt, and Gene could. A painting has no memory to lose, and Gene lost nearly all of hers. Behind that flawless, untouchable image was a woman who was touched by everything, who loved a daughter she was not allowed to keep, who was betrayed by her own father and abandoned by nearly every man she trusted, and who was rescued when she was rescued at all by the most unlikely stranger of them all. A woman who would have handed back every frame of that gorgeous film without a moment's hesitation to undo one cheerful sentence spoken to her at a garden party. The whole world fell in love with the portrait. Almost no one ever thought to grieve for the woman standing behind it. Perhaps after all these years we finally can,